Okay, in order to do this seam, again, I have pre-cut muslin. The notches here are indicated in red, and I've cut a piece of bias. This bias has been cut at 1 3/8 inches. So the first step will be to make a single needle seam from edge to edge at the notches, so we'll have 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to line up my needle with the notch. I'm going to use the hand wheel and do a couple of stitches to lock it in place. Back stitch. And then I'm going to continue sewing this seam at 1/2 inch. And then when I get to the edge, I'm going to back stitch. Again, always trim the thread close to your work so that you have a tail of thread from the machine. Trim as you go. So I'm going to clip here and here. Okay, in order to make this an open seam and not a closed seam, I am going to press this seam allowance open. So I am going to go to the iron and I'm going to separate the seam allowance and I'm going to press it open flat so that it looks like this. Another term for this kind of seam is called a busted seam, meaning it's been busted open. Once at the iron, it's always a good idea to just press your work along the stitch line. Don't worry if the iron is leaking, depending on what kind of fabric you're using. We're going to separate the seam allowance and we're going to press it so that the seam is open flat. Once you have the seam open flat, we are going to bind both sides. So we'll be treating each of the seam allowance sides separately. So you'll see that I've positioned this so that I only have seam allowance for one side. I'm going to take my binding and I'm going to put it here, lining up the edges, and I'm going to sew this or attach it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So once I have the edges lined up, I'm going to come over to the machine and I'm going to line the fabric up so that the edges are at 1/4 inch, and I'm going to back stitch. And I'm going to continue sewing this down at 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to back stitch at the end, and then I'm going to remove the work, clipping the thread so that it looks like this. So now I'm going to go to the iron. I'm going to take my work and I'm going to press the seam allowance toward the bias. This is the bias here. So we're just going to press it this way. Once we've done that, we are going to fold this edge and press this at 1/4 this way so the edges are facing each other. And then we're going to cover the first stitch with the edge of the bias like this so that the seam will be bound.